This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. H. Rider Haggard. Ayesha, The Return of She. Chapter 15. The Second Ordeal. Oros bowed and left the place, whereon the Hesea signed to us to stand upon her right and to Atene to stand upon her left. Presently from either side the hooded priests and priestesses stole into the chamber, and to the number of 50 or more ranged themselves along its walls. Then came two figures, draped in black and masked, who bore parchment books in their hands, and placed themselves on either side of the corpse, while Oros stood at its feet, facing the Hesea. Now she lifted the sistrum that she held, and, in obedience to the signal, Oros said, "Let the books be opened." Thereon the masked Accuser to the right broke the seal of his book and began to read its pages. It was a tale of the sins of this dead man, entered as fully as though that officer were his own conscience given life and voice. In cold and horrible detail it told of the evil doings of his childhood, of his youth and of his riper years, and thus massed together the record was black indeed. I listened amazed, wondering what spy had been set upon the deeds of yonder man throughout his days, thinking also with a shudder of how heavy would be the tale against any one of us, if such a spy should companion him from the cradle to the grave, remembering too that full surely this count is kept by scribes even more watchful than the ministers of Hes. At length the long story drew to its close. Lastly it told of the murder of that noble upon the banks of the river. It told of the plot against our lives for no just cause. It told of our cruel hunting with the death hounds and of its end. Then the Accuser shut his book and cast it on the ground, saying, "Such is the record, O Mother. Sum it up as thou hast been given wisdom." Without speaking, the Hesea pointed with the sistrum to the Defender, who thereon broke the seal of his book and began to read. Its tale spoke of all the good that the dead man had done, of every noble word that he had said, of every kind action, of plans which he had made for the welfare of his vassals, of temptations to ill that he had resisted, of the true love that he had borne to the woman who became his wife, of the prayers which he had made and of the offerings which he had sent to the temple of Hes. Making no mention of her name, it told of how that wife of his had hated him, of how she and the magician who had fostered and educated her and was her relative and guide, had set other women to lead him astray that she might be free of him. Of how too they had driven him mad with a poisonous drink which took away his judgment, unchained all the evil in his heart, and caused him by its baneful influence to shrink unnaturally from her whose love he still desired. Also it set out that the heaviest of his crimes were inspired by this wife of his, who sought to befoul his name in the ears of the people whom she led him to oppress, and how bitter jealousy drove him to cruel acts, the last and worst of which caused him foully to violate the law of hospitality and in attempting to bring about the death of blameless guests at their hands to find his own. Thus the Defender read, and having read closed the book and threw it on the ground, saying, "Such is the record, O Mother. Sum it up as thou hast been given wisdom." Then the Khania, who all this time had stood cold and impassive, stepped forward to speak, and with her her uncle, the Shaman Simbri. But before a word passed Atene's lips the Hesea raised her sceptre and forbade them, saying, "Thy day of trial is not yet, nor have we aught to do with thee. When thou liest where he lies, and the books of thy deeds are read aloud to her who sits in judgment, then let thine Advocate make answer for these things." "So be it," answered Atene haughtily, and fell back. Now it was the turn of the high priest Oros. "Mother," he said, "thou hast heard. Balance the writings, assess the truth, and according to thy wisdom issue thy commands. Shall we hurl him who was Rassen feet first into the fiery gulf that he may walk again in the paths of life, or head first, in token that he is dead indeed?" Then while all waited in a hushed expectancy, the great Priestess delivered her verdict. "I hear, I balance, I assess, but judge I do not, who claim no such power. Let the Spirit who sent him forth, to whom he is returned again, pass judgment on his spirit. This dead one has sinned deeply, yet has he been more deeply sinned against. Nor against that man can be reckoned the account of his deeds of madness. Cast him then to his grave, feet first, that his name may be whitened in the ears of those unborn, and that thence he may return again at the time appointed. It is spoken." Now the Accuser lifted the book of his accusations from the ground and advancing, hurled it into the gulf in token that it was blotted out. Then he turned and vanished from the chamber, while the Advocate, taking up his book, gave it into the keeping of the priest Oros, that it might be preserved in the archives of the temple for ever. This done, the priests began a funeral chant and a solemn invocation to the great Lord of the Underworld that he would receive this spirit and acquit it there as here it had been acquitted by the Hesea his minister. Ere their dirge ended, certain of the priests, advancing with slow steps, lifted the bier and carried it to the edge of the gulf, then at a sign from the Mother, hurled it feet foremost into the fiery lake below, whilst all watched to see how it struck the flame. For this they held to be an omen, since should the body turn over in its descent, it was taken as a sign that the judgment of mortal men had been refused in the place of the immortals. It did not turn. It rushed downwards straight as a plummet and plunged into the fire hundreds of feet below, and there for ever vanished. This indeed was not strange, since, as we discovered afterwards, the feet were weighted. In fact this solemn rite was but a formula that down to the exact words of judgment and committal had been practised here from unknown antiquity over the bodies of the priests and priestesses of the Mountain, and of certain of the great ones of the Plain. So it was in ancient Egypt, whence without doubt this ceremony of the trial of the dead was derived, and so it continued to be in the land of Hes, for no priestess ever ventured to condemn the soul of one departed. The real interest of the custom, apart from its solemnity and awful surroundings, centred in the accurate knowledge displayed by the masked Accuser and Advocate of the life deeds of the deceased. It showed that although the College of Hes affected to be indifferent to the doings and politics of the people of the Plain that they once ruled and over which, whilst secretly awaiting an opportunity of reconquest, they still claimed a spiritual authority, the attitude was assumed rather than real. Moreover, it suggested a system of espionage so piercing and extraordinary that it was difficult to believe it unaided by the habitual exercise of some gift of clairvoyance. The service, if I may call it so, was finished. The dead man had followed the record of his sins into that lurid sea of fire, and by now was but a handful of charred dust. But if his books had closed, ours remained open, and as